be reading a short story by Arthur C. Clarke called The Forgotten Enemy. The thick firs thudded softly to the ground as Professor Millward jerked himself upright on the narrow bed. This time he was sure it had been no dream. The freezing air that rasped against his lungs still seemed to echo with the sound that had come crashing out of the night. He gathered the furs around his shoulders and listened intently. All was quiet now. From the narrow windows in the western walls, long shafts of moonlight played upon the endless rows of books. As they played upon the dead city beneath, the world was utterly still. Even in the old days, the city would have been silent on such a night, and it was doubly silent now. With weary resolution, Professor Millward shuffled out of bed and doled a few lumps of coke into the glowing brazier. Then he made his way slowly towards the nearest window, pausing now and then to rest his hand lovingly on the volumes he had guarded all these years. He shielded his eyes from the brilliant moonlight and peered out into the night. The sky was cloudless. The sound he had heard had not been thunder, whatever it might have been. It had come from the north, and even as he waited, it came again. Distance had softened it. Distance and the bulk of the hills that lay beyond London. It did not race across the sky with the wantonness of thunder, but seemed to come from a single point far to the north. It was like no natural sound he had ever heard, and for a moment he dared to hope again. Only man, he was sure, could have made such a sound. Perhaps the dream that had kept him here, among these treasures of civilization, for more than 20 years would be a dream no longer. Men were returning to England, blasting their way through the ice and snow with the weapons that science had given them before the coming of the dust. It was strange that they should come by land and from the north, but he thrust aside any thoughts that would quench the newly kindled flame of hope. 300 feet below, the broken sea of snow-covered roofs lay bathed in bitter moonlight. Miles away, the tall stacks of Battersea Power Station glimmered like thin white ghosts against the night sky. Now that the dome of St. Paul's had collapsed beneath the weight of the snow, they alone challenged his supremacy. Professor Millward walked slowly back among the bookshelves, thinking over the plan that had formed in his mind. 20 years ago, he had watched the last helicopters climbing heavily out of Regent's Park, the rotors churning the ceaselessly falling snow. Even then, when the silence had closed around him, he could not bring himself to believe that the North had been abandoned forever. Yet already he had waited a whole generation among the books to which he had dedicated his life. In those early days, he had sometimes heard over the radio, which was his only contact with the South, of the struggle to colonize the now temperate lands of the equator. He did not know the outcome of that far-off battle, fought with desperate skill in the dying jungles and across deserts that had already felt the first touch of snow. Perhaps it had failed. The radio had been silent now for 15 years or more. Yet if men and machines were indeed returning from the north of all directions, he might again be able to hear their voices as they spoke to one another and to the lands from which they had come. Professor Millward left the university building perhaps a dozen times a year, and then only through sheer necessity. Over the past 2 decades, he had collected everything he needed from the shops in the Bloomsbury area. For in the final exodus, vast supplies of stocks had been left behind through lack of transport. In many ways, indeed, his life could be called luxurious. No professor of English literature had ever been clothed in such garments as those he had taken from an Oxford Street furrier's. The sun was blazing from a cloudless sky as he shouldered his pack and unlocked the massive gates. Even 10 years ago, packs of starving dogs had haunted in this area, and though he had seen none for years, he was still cautious and always carried a revolver when he went out into the open. The sunlight was so brilliant that the reflected glare hurt his eyes, but it was almost wholly lacking in heat, although the belt of cosmic dust through which the solar system was now passing had made little visible difference to the sun's brightness. It had robbed it of all strength. No one knew whether the world would swim out into the warmth again in 10 or 1,000 years, and civilization had fled southward in search of lands where the word summer was not an empty mockery. The latest drifts had packed hard, and Professor Millward had little difficulty in making the journey to Tottenham Court Road. Sometimes it had taken him hours of floundering through the snow, and one year he had been sealed in his great concrete watchtower for 9 months. He kept away from the houses with their dangerous burdens of snow and their Damoclean icicles, and went north until he came to the shop where he was seeking. The words above the shattered windows were still bright. Jenkins and Sons, radio and electrical, television, a specialty. Some snow had drifted through a broken section of the roofing, but the little upstairs room had not altered since his last visit, a dozen years ago. The all-wave radio still stood on the table, and empty tins, scattered on the floor, spoke mutely of the lonely hours he had spent here before all hope had died. He wondered if he must go through the same ordeal again. Professor Millward brushed the snow from the copy of the Amateur Radio Handbook for 1965, which had taught him what little he knew about wireless. The test meters and batteries were still lying in their half-remembered places, and to his relief, some of the batteries still held their charge. He searched through the stock until he'd built up the necessary power supplies, and checked the radio as well as he could. Then he was ready. It was a pity he could never send the manufacturers the testimonial they deserved. The faint hiss from the speaker brought back memories of the BBC, of the 9 o'clock news, and the symphony concerts, of all the things he had taken for granted in a world that was gone like a dream. With scarcely controlled impatience, he ran across the wave bands, but everywhere there was nothing save that omnipresent hiss. That was disappointing, but no more. He remembered that the real test would come at night. In the meantime, he would forage among the surrounding shops for anything that might be useful. It was dusk when he returned to the little room. 100 miles above his head, tenuous and invisible, the heavy-side layer would be expanding outward toward the stars as the sun went down. So it had done every evening for millions of years, and for half a century only man had used it for his own purposes, to reflect around the world his messages of hate or peace, to echo with trivialities, or to sound with music, once called immortal. Slowly, with infinite patience, Professor Millward began to traverse the shortwave bands that a generation ago had been a babel of shouting voices and stabbing Morse. Even as he listened, the faint hope he had dared to cherish began to fade within him. The city itself was no more silent than the once crowded oceans of ether. Only the faint crackle of thunderstorms, half the world away, broke the intolerable stillness. Man had abandoned his latest conquest. Soon after midnight, the batteries faded out. Professor Millward did not have the heart to search more, but curled up in his furs and fell into a troubled sleep. He got what consolation he could from the thought that if he had not proved his theory, he had not disproved it either. The heatless sunlight was flooding the lonely white road when he began his homeward journey. He was very tired, for he had slept little, and his sleep had been broken by the recurring fantasy of rescue. The silence was suddenly broken by the distant thunder that came rolling over the white roofs. It came, there could be no doubt now, from beyond the northern hills that had once been London's playground. From the buildings on either side, little avalanches of snow went swishing out into the wild street. Then the silence returned. Professor Millward stood motionless, weighing, considering, analyzing. The sound had been too long drawn to be an ordinary explosion. He was dreaming again. It was nothing less than distant thunder of an atomic bomb, burning and blasting away the snow, 1,000,000 tons at a time. His hopes revived, and the disappointments of the night began to fade. That momentary pause almost cost him his life. Out of a side street, something huge and white moved suddenly into his field of vision. For a moment his mind refused to accept the reality of what he saw. Then the paralysis left him, and he fumbled desperately for his futile revolver. Batting towards him across the snow, swinging its head from side to side with a hypnotic serpentine motion, was a huge polar bear. He dropped his belongings and ran, floundering over the snow toward the nearest buildings. Providentially, the underground entrance was only 50 feet away. The steel grille was closed, but he remembered breaking the lock many years ago. The temptation to look back was almost intolerable, for he could hear nothing to tell how near his pursuer was. For one frightful moment, the iron lattice resisted his numbed fingers. Then it yielded reluctantly, and he forced his way through the narrow opening. Out of his childhood there came a sudden, incongruous memory of an albino ferret he had once seen weaving its body ceaselessly across the wire netting of his cage. There was the same reptile grace in the monstrous shape, almost twice as high as a man, that reared itself in baffled fury against the grill. The metal bowed, but did not yield beneath the pressure, and then the bear dropped to the ground, grunted softly, and padded away. It slashed once or twice at the fallen haversack, scattering a few tins of food into the snow, and vanished silently as it had come. A very shaken Professor Millward reached the university 3 hours later, after moving in short bounds from one refuge to the next. After all these years, he was no longer alone in the city. He wondered if there were other visitors. In that same night, he knew the answer. Just before dawn, he heard, quite distinctly, the cry of a wolf from somewhere in the direction of Hyde Park. By the end of the week, he knew that the animals of the north were on the move. Once he saw a reindeer running southward, pursued by a pack of silent wolves, and sometimes in the night there were sounds of deadly conflict. He was amazed that so much life still existed in the white wilderness between London and the pole. Now something was driving it southward, and the knowledge brought him a mounting excitement. He did not believe that these fierce survivors would flee from anything save man. The strain of waiting was beginning to affect Professor Milward's mind, and for hours he would sit in the cold sunlight, his furs wrapped around him, dreaming of rescue and thinking of the way in which men might be returning to England. Perhaps an expedition had come from North America across the Atlantic ice. It might have been years upon its way. But why had it come so far north? His favorite theory was that the Atlantic icepacks were not safe enough for heavy traffic further to the south. One thing, however, could not explain to his satisfaction. There had been no air reconnaissance. It was hard to believe that the art of flight had been lost so soon. Sometimes he would walk along the ranks of books, whispering now and then to a well-loved volume. There were books here that he had not dared to open for years. They reminded him so poignantly of the past. Now, as the days grew longer and brighter, he would sometimes take down a volume of poetry and reread his old favorites. Then he would go to the tall windows and shout the magic words over the rooftops, as if they would break the spell that had gripped the world. It was warmer now, as if the ghosts of lost summers had returned to haunt the land. For whole days the temperature rose above freezing, while in many places flowers were breaking through the snow. Whatever was approaching from the north was nearer, and several times a day that enigmatic roar would go thundering over the city, sending the snow sliding upon 1,000 roofs. There were strange, grinding undertones that Professor Millward found baffling and even ominous. At times, it was almost as if he were listening to the clash of mighty armies. Sometimes a mad but dreadful thought came into his mind and would not be dismissed. Often he would wake in the night and imagine he had heard the sound of mountains moving to the sea. So the summer wore away. As the sound of that distant battle drew steadily nearer, Professor Millward was a prey of ever more violently alternating hopes and fears. Although he saw no more wolves or bears, they seemed to have fled southward. He did not risk leaving the safety of its fortress. Every morning he would climb to the highest window of the tower and search the northern horizon with field glasses. But all he ever saw was a stubborn retreat of snows above Hampstead as they fought their bitter rearguard action against the sun. His vigil ended with the last days of the brief summer. The grinding thunder in the night had been nearer than ever before, but there was still nothing to hint at its real distance from the city. Professor Millward felt no premonition as he climbed to the narrow window and raised his binoculars to the northern sky. As a watcher from the walls of some threatened fortress might have seen the first sunlight glinting on the spears of an advancing army, so in that moment Professor Millward knew the truth. The air was crystal clear, and the hills were sharp and brilliant against the cold blue of the night sky. They had lost almost all their snow. Once he would have rejoiced at that, but it meant nothing now. Overnight, the enemy he had forgotten had conquered the last defenses and was preparing for the final onslaught. As he saw that deadly glitter along the crest of the doomed hills, Professor Millward understood at last that the sound he had heard advancing for so many months, it was a little wonder he had dreamed of mountains on the march out of the north, their ancient home, returning in triumph to the lands they had once possessed. The glaciers had come again. Thanks for watching.